I never imagined the man I trusted the most would make me question everything I believed about love and family. But that night, when I opened the door to see him standing there, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name, I knew my world was about to change forever. What started as comfort and support quickly spiraled into something neither of us could control. And now I can never go back. I always believed my life was settled, a quiet, predictable routine that kept me grounded. After losing my husband, Daniel, 10 years ago, I convinced myself that love and passion were behind me. My days were spent painting landscapes in my sunlit studio, sipping coffee on the porch, and tending to my garden. It was a peaceful life, but one that often felt lonely. Then came Ryan, my sister's son, broken, defeated, and searching for a place to heal. His marriage had fallen apart, and his career as a writer had stalled. When my sister called, her voice trembling as she explained his struggles, I didn't hesitate to invite him in. The first time I saw him standing on my doorstep, duffel bag in hand and sadness etched across his face, I felt an overwhelming need to protect him. He looked so much like his mother, my sister, but carried a quiet strength I hadn't seen before. I prepared a cozy room for him overlooking the garden, adding fresh flowers and books I thought he might enjoy. He seemed grateful, his smile faint but genuine. At first, we kept our distance. He spent hours in his room, tapping away at his laptop or staring out the window. I respected his need for space, offering gentle encouragement but never pushing. Slowly, we fell into a rhythm. We cooked dinner together, shared long walks through the hills, and talked about everything from his writing dreams to my past with Daniel. I saw him start to relax, his shoulders less tense, his smile more frequent. One evening, as we sipped tea on the porch, he opened up about his fears of failure, loneliness, and losing himself. I reached out to hold his hand, offering reassurance, and in that moment something shifted. It was subtle at first, a lingering gaze, a touch that lasted a little too long. I brushed it off as harmless, convincing myself that it was just the closeness of family. But deep down I felt it, the spark, the tension that I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was nothing. But in the quiet of the night, when the house was still and my thoughts were loud, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already begun. At first, I ignored the way Ryan looked at me, the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long when we talked. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was mistaking gratitude for something more. But the moments started adding up. One night, we were clearing the dishes after dinner. I brushed past him in the narrow kitchen, and our hands touched. It was brief, accidental, but it sent a shiver up my spine. I looked up, and he was already watching me, his expression unreadable. I laughed nervously, brushing it off, but my heart raced for the rest of the evening. Over the next few days, the tension between us only grew. He started joining me more often in my studio, sitting quietly as I painted. At first, I welcomed his presence. It felt nice to have someone admire my work, to share in my quiet world. But then came the questions, the personal ones. "Do you ever feel lonely?" he asked one afternoon, his voice soft. I paused, my brush hovering above the canvas. "Sometimes," I admitted, my words feeling heavier than I intended. "I do too," he said, stepping closer. "But not when I'm here." His words hung in the air, and I felt my pulse quicken. I turned back to my painting, pretending not to notice how close he had come. But I noticed everything: the warmth of his presence, the slight brush of his arm against mine as he leaned over to look at my work. It was becoming harder to ignore the chemistry between us. I caught myself paying more attention to him. How his voice softened when he spoke to me, how his hands lingered when he passed me a dish or poured me a glass of wine. And then there were the nights, the long, restless nights when I lay in bed thinking about him, replaying every word, every touch, every look. I hated myself for it. He was my nephew, my sister's son, and I had been the one to offer him shelter and support. But the lines between us were beginning to blur, and the more I tried to deny it, the more obvious it became. The breaking point came late one night. I was in my studio working on a painting when I heard footsteps outside the door. My heart leaped into my throat. "Ryan!" I called out, my voice unsteady. The door creaked open, and there he was, his face half lit by the glow of the desk lamp. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I nodded, setting down my brush as he stepped inside and closed the door. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken words. Then he stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "You're the only person who makes me feel like I'm not falling apart," he said. My breath caught. I wanted to tell him to stop, to turn around and leave before we crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But I didn't. Instead, I reached out and touched his hand. It was supposed to be comforting, reassuring, but the moment our skin touched, I felt it. The spark. And in that moment, I knew, whatever this was, whatever we were heading toward, it was already too late to stop. The night after Ryan came to my studio, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding as I replayed his words. How he said I made him feel whole again. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a fleeting moment of vulnerability, but the warmth of his touch lingered like an echo I couldn't escape. The next morning, I avoided him, burying myself in housework and pretending nothing had changed. But it had. And when I finally saw him later that afternoon, standing in the garden with sunlight catching in his hair, the tension hit me like a wave. "Can I help?" he asked, stepping closer. I hesitated. "Sure," I said, handing him the shears. We worked side by side, cutting back overgrown branches and pulling weeds. Every now and then, our hands brushed, and each time my pulse quickened. I told myself it was harmless, that I was imagining the heat that seemed to build between us. But the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing in the world that mattered, made it impossible to believe that. That evening, we sat in the living room by the fire. Ryan poured us each a glass of wine, and we talked about his writing, my paintings, and the dreams we'd let slip away. "You're incredible, Olivia," he said suddenly, his voice soft but firm. I looked at him, startled. "What?" "The way you've rebuilt your life," he continued. "After everything you've been through. You're stronger than you know." His words made my heart ache. I felt exposed, as if he saw parts of me I hadn't let anyone see in years. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched his hand. "Thank you," I whispered. He didn't let go. Instead, he turned his hand, lacing his fingers through mine. The room seemed to shrink, the air thickening between us. "This feels wrong," I said, but I didn't pull away. "Does it?" he asked, leaning closer. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to remind him that I was his aunt, that this couldn't happen. But when his lips brushed mine, my resolve shattered. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, testing, but it quickly deepened, and I felt myself sinking into it. My body responded before my mind could catch up, and suddenly, the line between us was gone. When we finally pulled apart, his eyes searched mine, as if he was waiting for me to say something. But I couldn't. Words felt impossible. For days afterward, we danced around what had happened. We acted as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The tension only grew stronger, and every look, every touch seemed to pull us closer to the edge. One evening, as we washed dishes after dinner, he stopped and turned to me. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice raw. I froze, my hands trembling. "Ryan, we can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, stepping closer. "No one has ever made me feel the way you do. And I know you feel it too." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right. I did feel it. When he reached out and brushed a strand of hair behind my ear, I didn't stop him. And when he leaned in and kissed me again, I didn't pull away. This time there was no hesitation, no second guessing. It was raw and desperate, like we were both clinging to something we knew we shouldn't want but couldn't resist. Later that night, as I lay in bed, his words replayed in my mind. "No one has ever made me feel this way." I wanted to tell myself it was a mistake, that it would stop there. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Because now that we'd crossed the line, there was no turning back. And the deeper we fell, the harder it would be to face the truth about what we had done. Tea was late, past midnight, when I heard the soft knock at my bedroom door. My heart raced as I sat up, already knowing who it was. "Ryan," I whispered. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside. He looked hesitant, his shoulders tense, but his eyes held the same longing I had tried to ignore for days. "I couldn't sleep," he said softly. I swallowed, my pulse quickening. "You shouldn't be here." "But I am," he replied, stepping closer. "And so are you." I should have told him to leave. I should have reminded him that this was wrong, that we were crossing a line we could never uncross. But when he sat down on the edge of the bed, his hand brushing against mine, I didn't stop him. Instead, I leaned in. The kiss was desperate, filled with all the emotions we had been holding back. Before I knew it, his arms were around me, pulling me closer, and I felt myself giving in completely. It wasn't until the bedroom door creaked again that reality came crashing down. I froze, pulling away as the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. "Oh my God," I whispered, my chest tightening. Ryan jumped up, panic flashing across his face. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know. But the thought of someone seeing us, knowing what we had done, sent chills down my spine. We stood there in silence, waiting for the footsteps to fade, but the damage was already done. The fear, the guilt, it was suffocating. The next morning, everything felt different. Ryan avoided me and I avoided him. The easy conversations and lingering touches were gone, replaced by awkward silences and stolen glances. I wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, that we could go back to how things were before. But the truth hung between us like a storm cloud, ready to break. That evening, as I sat in the studio trying to paint, Ryan walked in. "We need to talk," he said, his voice strained. I set down my brush, bracing myself. "I can't do this," he said. "I thought I could, but it's tearing me apart." I nodded, my throat tightening. "Me too. But I don't want to leave," he continued. "Being with you feels more real than anything I've ever had. And I don't know how to let that go." Tears stung my eyes. "Ryan, we can't keep doing this. It's wrong." "Then tell me you don't feel it," he challenged. "Tell me this doesn't mean anything to you." I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Because I couldn't lie, not to him and not to myself. Instead, I broke down, tears spilling over as he pulled me into his arms. For a moment, I let myself stay there, feeling the warmth of his embrace, and wishing things could be different. But reality wouldn't let me stay in that moment for long. I pulled away, wiping my tears. "You need to leave." He looked devastated, but he didn't argue. That night, I lay awake, staring at the empty space where he had been, my chest aching with guilt and longing. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen table. "Olivia, I'm sorry. I can't stay here. I need to figure out who I am without leaning on you. But please know that you've given me hope. Hope that I can heal, and that love is still possible. Thank you for everything. Ryan." I clutched the note, tears streaming down my face. I knew it was for the best, but it didn't make it hurt any less. In the days that followed, the house felt emptier than ever. I tried to lose myself in my paintings, but nothing could erase the memory of him. The sound of his laughter, the way his touch had set my skin on fire. Then, one afternoon, I saw his name on my phone screen. "I miss you." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to respond, to tell him I missed him too. But another part, the part that knew we couldn't go back, forced me to put the phone down. Because no matter how much I wanted him, I knew we had already gone too far. And some lines, once crossed, could never be erased. The silence in the house was unbearable after Ryan left. Every room seemed to echo with his absence, and I couldn't escape the memories we had created. The laughter in the kitchen, the quiet conversations on the porch, and the heat of his touch that still lingered on my skin. I tried to focus on my paintings, hoping they would give me the distraction I so desperately needed. But no matter how many hours I spent with a brush in my hand, my thoughts always drifted back to him. The guilt clawed at me, yet so did the longing. I knew what we had done was wrong, but it hadn't felt wrong in the moment. It had felt inevitable, like a storm we saw coming but couldn't avoid. Days turned into weeks, and I told myself I was moving on. But every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped, hoping it was him. It never was. Then one evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, my sister called. "Ryan's back in the city," she said. "He told me he needed space to clear his head. I think he's still struggling, but he sounds better. I just wanted to thank you for taking care of him." Her words cut through me like a blade. She had no idea what had really happened, how I had crossed a line I could never uncross. "Of course," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I just wanted him to feel safe. But I didn't feel safe. Not from the guilt. Not from the shame. And certainly not from the part of me that still wanted him." A week later, I received a letter. My hands trembled as I opened it, recognizing Ryan's handwriting immediately. "Olivia, I'm sorry I left without saying goodbye. I didn't know how to face you after everything that happened. But I need you to know that I don't regret it. Not the way I felt. Not the way you made me feel alive again. I just regret that it couldn't be more. I've started therapy and I'm writing again. It's hard, but I'm finding my way. I hope you're doing the same. You deserve happiness, Olivia. Please don't forget that. Thank you for everything. Ryan." Tears blurred my vision as I read his words. I wanted to write back to tell him that he had given me hope too, even if it came at a cost. But I knew I couldn't. Instead, I folded the letter carefully and tucked it away, letting it become part of the story I would carry with me forever. In the months that followed, I tried to rebuild my life. I threw myself into painting, pouring every emotion onto the canvas. My work became darker, more emotional, and for the first time in years I felt truly connected to my art. Friends began to notice the change. "Your paintings feel so raw, one of them said during an exhibition. It's like you've unlocked something inside yourself. I smiled, but I didn't explain. Because how could I? How could I tell them that my greatest artistic breakthrough had come from my greatest mistake? Then one day another letter arrived. This time it was accompanied by a book, Ryan's latest novel. Inside the cover he had written, "To Olivia, thank you for reminding me who I am. I hope this story brings you peace." I traced the words with my fingertips, feeling the weight of everything we had shared pressing down on me. I read the book in one sitting, unable to put it down. It was raw and honest, filled with characters who were lost, broken, and searching for redemption. And in every word I saw echoes of us, of the love we had dared to feel and the pain we had caused. By the time I reached the last page, I was crying again. But this time the tears felt different, less like grief and more like release. I knew we would never be the same. What we had shared was forbidden, dangerous, and impossible. But it had also been real. And even though it had broken me, it had also taught me how to put myself back together. As I placed the book on my shelf, I took a deep breath and let it go. Because some stories aren't meant to have happy endings. But that doesn't mean they don't matter. The months that followed felt like a slow unraveling, a process of rebuilding myself piece by piece. Ryan's absence lingered in the empty spaces of the house, but over time, the ache dulled. The memories didn't vanish, but they softened, like paintings faded by the sun. I poured myself into my art, using it to work through the emotions I couldn't say out loud. My paintings grew bolder, more abstract, each brushstroke carrying the weight of my guilt, longing, and self-forgiveness. I began selling my work again, even hosting a small exhibition in town. People complimented the raw emotion in my pieces, but they didn't know the truth, that the canvases held the echoes of a love I could never name. Ryan's letters stopped coming after the book. I told myself it was for the best, but there were nights I stared at my phone, wondering if he ever thought of me the way I thought of him. Then one day I received an invitation. It was for the launch party of Ryan's second book. My heart raced as I held the card, but I knew I couldn't go. Instead, I sent him a letter. "Ryan, I'm so proud of you. Your words touched me in ways I can't explain. I hope this new chapter of your life brings you peace and happiness. Thank you for everything, for reminding me what it feels like to be alive. With love, Olivia." I didn't expect a reply, and none came. But somehow that letter felt like closure. The final brushstroke on a painting that would always hang in the back of my mind. As time passed, I began to see our story differently. It wasn't just about forbidden love or broken rules. It was about vulnerability, connection, and the way we sometimes find comfort in places we shouldn't. It was a mistake, but it was also a moment of truth, one that forced me to confront parts of myself I had buried for years. I learned that loneliness can be dangerous, that it can make us reach for things that aren't ours to hold. But I also learned that we're stronger than we think, that even in the aftermath of brokenness, we can rebuild. And while I'll always carry a piece of Ryan with me, I've made peace with what we were, and what we couldn't be. Now, when I look at my paintings, I see more than just colors and shapes. I see a woman who survived, who faced her darkest desires and came out the other side. And for the first time in years, I feel ready to start again. What would you have done if you were in Olivia's position? Could you walk away from forbidden feelings, or would you give in to temptation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional and thought-provoking tales like this one. Stay tuned. Our next story might just leave you questioning everything you believe about love and betrayal.